Welcome to the Real Estate Library, and today we're going to talk about the appraisal process. Whether you're buying or selling a home, the appraisal is a key component in the transaction. An appraiser is essentially a licensed independent party that gives their opinion of what the current fair market value for that property is. And if you are using a mortgage to buy a property, an appraisal is going to be a requirement of that transaction. It's usually paid for by the buyer as part of their closing costs for the loan, and it's an out-of-pocket expense. So there's only really two expenses for you as a buyer that you should be paying out of pocket. All money in real estate is exchanged through an escrow account, but you do have two expenses out of pocket normally, and that's the home inspection and the appraisal. So the appraiser is going to come out, they're going to do a full inspection of the property in terms of walkthrough. They don't get up in the attic or do the things that a home inspector would. They just come and check the overall condition of the property, and then they're going to drive the neighborhood and they're going to compare properties that are similar to that one that have recently sold to that property, and then they'll make adjustments. Does this one have a view? Does this one have road noise? Does this one have in a flight path? And then they'll come to what they determine fair market value for that specific property. They'll put together a very detailed report, and then they'll send that report back to the mortgage company. On a side note, if you're a cash buyer, which is obviously less common, it's not a requirement in a real estate transaction that you get an appraisal, but it is smart. If you're spending that kind of money, it definitely is a good investment of a few $100s to have a licensed licensed appraiser come out and give you their opinion of the fair market value of that property. But if you're like most people and you're using a mortgage, you're going to get an appraiser. So the appraiser is going to do his report. He's going to send it back to the bank, and then the buyer's agent will also get a copy of it. Now, there's three things that can happen once an appraisal has been completed. One is that the appraisal came back more than what you. One is that the appraisal came back more than what you offered. If that's the case, that is great news for you as a buyer. So let's say, for example, that you offered $475,000 for a house. The seller accepts your offer, you get into escrow, you get the appraisal, and the bank says that the house is worth $500,000. Perfect, great. You have $25,000 worth of equity. You're getting a great deal. That's the ideal situation. What's more common is that the appraiser will give their report and the purchase price or your offer amount is equal to or pretty much in line with the appraisal. And that's where you're paying exactly fair market value, and that's okay too. In the long run, real estate's always a good investment, and as long as you're not paying more than the property's worth, that's a fine outcome. The third thing that can happen is that the appraiser will determine that you're paying more than the fair market value for the property. So let's say you offered $475,000, and then the appraiser says, whoops, the house is worth $450,000. You're offering $25,000 too much for this property. And then what do you do in that situation? Well, there's three outcomes from that as well. Three things that can happen. The first is that you have, and this would be against my advice. It'd be against my advice for all my clients, is that you don't pay more than fair market value for a property. But if for some reason you have an emotional attachment, or this house is really one of a kind, or you don't agree with the appraiser, what you have the funds to do it, whatever it may be, that you really love this property and you're willing to essentially put more money down and pay more than fair market value for that property. Those cases are few and far between. Most of the time what happens if you get an appraisal report and you realize that you offered more than what the appraiser thinks that the property is worth, we'll have to renegotiate. And sometimes that's where deals can fall apart, because the seller is in their right to say, you know what, you agreed to pay $500,000 for this property. I don't care what the appraisal says. I want to keep you to your word, and this is what I want to get for the property. If you don't want to pay it, then I'm going to put it back on the market. And sometimes that happens, and the seller's in their right to do that. Most of the time what happens is that we renegotiate. So if it's, let's say, a $2,000 or a $5,000 difference, the seller may be willing to either reduce the purchase price or to credit the buyer some closing costs. So those are two ways that we can handle that. For the most part, once you're that far into the transaction, we really don't want to lose it over $2,000 to $5,000. If it's a bigger amount than that and it requires more negotiation, that can happen sometimes too. But the seller also needs to understand before they decide to cancel a transaction and put the house back on the market is that you will have to disclose that appraisal to any potential future buyers for the next 6 months. So if you put the house back on the market trying to get more than what an appraiser has already determined that property to be, it's going to be a very tough battle for you, because even though the new buyer is going to get their own independent appraisal, it's most likely going to be pretty much in line with what the other licensed appraiser had given you. So that is that about appraisals. If you guys have any questions about that process, feel free to send me a direct message or go to my website and get in touch with me that way. And we'll see you on the next video.